next presenter, Teresa Vasquez-Terry, will present her dissertation, REMLE Project, a study utilizing the iPad 2 with families of individuals with ASD.
My name is Teresa Vasquez-Terry, and I'm the principal investigator for the REMLE Project, which is a study that utilized the iPad with families of individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorder. I'd like for you to meet my son, REMLE. When he was 4, he was diagnosed with low-functioning autism, which means that he had deficits in communication as well as social interaction. So frustrated by the lack of services and the lack of time dedicated for these services, I took my knowledge of technology and integrated with my husband's knowledge of education and how children learn. And we created an intervention that within a year had my son communicating more effectively as well as responding better in social situations. 6 years later, I'm proud to announce that my son still continues to astound the autism community, as he's now classified as high functioning, which is very rare in autism diagnoses. Now, I share this information with you not because my husband and I are experts, but because we felt that we were empowered enough to use the knowledge that we had to create intervention for our son, which also fit within our family routines. Unfortunately, this is not the case for all families of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. They feel vulnerable, isolated, and defeated, primarily to lack of collaboration, lack of accessibility to evidence-based interventions, a lack of best practices, and there's this whole gap that exists between research and practice. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm so nervous. However, that's not to say that there aren't studies that don't exist that have used the evidence-based practices in the tech framework, because there are. And they have all been highly successful, but they've had huge limitations, such as small sample sizes, with the largest study having 10 in its population. The focus was mainly on high-functioning autism. The duration of the study was a matter of days rather than weeks. They used non-representative samples of the entire population. There was a lack of family participation. And then after the studies were over, there was this whole inaccessibility to the evidence-based interventions to put into practice. Therefore, future research needs call for 4 specific things: an adoption of best practices, successful and efficient intervention approaches, interventions that are easy to administer and that require full family participation. So just really quickly, a show of hands, how many of you own a mobile technology device? That's a lot. Have you ever seen a child, your child or another child, interact with these devices? Okay, so can you imagine being a parent of an individual with autism whose child cannot communicate, who cannot function in social situations, being given their child one of these devices and to watch a light turn on? It's like a miracle happens, right? So what happened was these families started going out in droves purchasing these iPad devices. Whether they had positive or negative impact, we don't really know. And so that's really what the significance of this study is to identify whether or not families really should feel empowered enough to go out and begin to buy these technology devices. And then the second significance is to identify whether or not professional approval is really necessary. So the purpose of this study was to create a best practices model, to identify what type of training is necessary, if training is necessary, and then also to identify whether or not the iPad or its applications are effective tools for non-professionals to implement evidence-based interventions. So looking at that, what I studied was empowerment, social validity, and response to intervention. Now, probably not response to intervention in the way that you think. I'm speaking specifically response to this specific intervention on the triad of impairments, which I'll talk about a little later. So questions 1 and 2 directly dealt with empowerment in its expression. Question 1 asked families, do you feel empowered after this intervention? While question 2 asked, how is your technological competence, which asks exactly how is your empowerment expressed, because over 90% of the families who participated in this study had little to no tech experience. So this concept of empowerment is the idea that families have choice, they feel involved, they feel like they can participate, and they have active participation in the groups of their kids' knowledge and just education. So an empowered family displays confidence and effectiveness in their attitudes, and they not only feel like they can advocate for their children, but also on behalf of all children. So question 3 takes us to the whole concept or idea of social validity. And when you think of social validity, what exactly is that? Well, it's this whole idea that the population that's being studied are okay with the intervention that you're using with them. So there's this whole social significance of goals, the appropriateness of the procedures, as well as the importance of the effects. Most studies measure this, autism studies measure this, because it helps us to anticipate the acceptance or rejection by consumers. It's also an indicator of success, and it also helps us to indicate what the family family's needs and focuses are for the future. Questions 4 and 5 deal specifically with response to intervention. Question 4 asks, okay, we've already asked you these subjective questions of whether or not you like the intervention or whether or not you feel empowered, but does it actually work? Question 4 takes that a step further and says, well, if the intervention actually works, which diagnosis performs better in which condition? Now, we measure response to intervention because anytime you use assistive technology with anyone on the spectrum, it helps us to identify the role of parents in intervention because, as you know, assistive technology takes place over the entire scope of the day. It's not just at school, it's not just at home, it's everywhere. Now, before we get into the findings, I think it's important that we take a step back and really identify what autism spectrum disorder is. It's classified by 3 specific deficits which are known as the triad of impairments. These diagnoses range from low to high functioning, and individuals with ASD share similar symptoms. However, the severity and nature of the symptoms can differ by each individual, which is why it's considered a spectrum disorder. Yet, autism is treatable with evidence-based interventions. Now, this study was a double-blind, randomized controlled trial which utilized both qualitative and quantitative measures. The researcher implemented a marketing strategy which used web, print, and social media campaigns and identified over 300 families as the accessible population. However, due to limited time and availability of devices, 90 families were selected by the research assistant and randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment groups, or one of 3 conditions. Either the control group, which had access to an iPad and any app that was available through the iTunes store, or the App Academy group, which had access to the iPad and any app that had been pre-selected based on a set of evidence-based practices. They also had training on these applications, while the App Academy Plus group had access to everything that the App Academy group had access to, but they also received training on evidence-based practices, which could be used inside or outside of a technologically based framework. We used 6-week rolling sessions, pre and post-test design, online format, and we also used weekly assessments and journal entries in order to ensure that the people were completing the training via a secure website. The instrumentation that was used were all Likert scales, and all of these measures are gold standard for the industry. So, let's go back to question number 1, which asks parents, do you feel empowered at the completion of this intervention? What we found was that there was a significant main effect for overall empowerment, which means between pre and post-test, as a whole, the entire sample made significant progress. What this indicates is that access to the iPad increased empowerment in all groups. Question 2, if you remember, talks about how empowerment is expressed. What we found was that there was a significant main effect for technology, which means between pre and post-test, as a whole, the entire sample made significant progress. But we also found a significant interaction between the control group and the App Academy group. What this indicates is that perceived technological competency did increase. However, the App Academy group made significantly more progress than the control group. Research question number 3 asks again about social validity. Does the population like the intervention? What we found was that there was a significant main effect for overall social validity, which means between pre and post-test, as a whole, the entire sample made significant progress. This indicates that access to the iPad, as well as the respective trainings, exceeded the expectations of participating families, and that this intervention is socially valid. Now we're stepping away again from the subjective measures, and we want to know, does this really work? Because I mean, when the rubber hits the road, that's really what matters, right? We have to ensure that whatever we put in front of our kids is not negatively impacting them, especially when it comes to autism. What we found was that there was a significant finding for the main effect for condition, which means there was a difference between the conditions. The control group was significantly different than both the App Academy and the App Academy Plus group, with the control group making negative progress. What this indicates is that training and access to the apps that adhere to evidence-based practices have a significantly positive impact on the triad of impairments. Now, question 5 is really the one that I really enjoyed very much. I'm asked specifically what diagnosis and condition goes better with empowerment, social validity, and response to intervention. What we found was that in regards to empowerment, social validity, and tech competency, the results were unchanged. They were exactly the same. But for response to intervention, there was a significant finding. What we found was that individuals who were diagnosed with autistic disorder, whose families participated in either the App Academy or the App Academy Plus group, made significantly more progress than the control group. That mimics what we found earlier, right? But we also found that individuals with PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, did significantly better in the App Academy Plus group, while the individuals diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, whose parents participated or family members participated in the App Academy group, did more significantly better than in any other group. What this indicates is that specific diagnoses may have better outcomes depending on the specific condition. So in summary, family choice is an empowering aspect of iPad use as an assistive technology device. The iPad 2 is socially valid and easy to use, and training and access only to apps that adhere to evidence-based practices are essential to treating the triad of impairments. As such, I created a best practices model which addressed all of the problems as well as the future needs that we identified earlier in the study. What we found was that accessibility to the training in the iPad, as well as making it disseminated to all the groups that would need it, providing training, and then empowering them to be able to plan, apply, and evaluate, all in a technologically based framework, does produce significantly positive outcomes on the triad of impairments. The limitations to this study were time. I wish I had more time. We all wish we had more time. There was a lack of availability to the devices. I only had 15 devices, which means I had to do rolling sessions. There is possibility for pretest sensitization to the treatments, and that the intervention and the training were delivered fully online, and so this may or may not have met all the learning styles of the participants. Recommendations for future study is to possibly identify if gender plays a factor, because we know that girls who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder typically are more lower functioning than boys. Also, the use of the iPad and intervention with differing populations of special needs, that'd be an interesting study. And the third one is to make provisions to measure the sample at intervals after the time they've completed the study to see if there's any generalization that occurs, because generalization is important in autism studies. Are there any questions?
So going back to your, and you don't need to flip back to it, but going back to your slide, I have found it interesting that if a child has Asperger's syndrome, you got more positive results with App Academy, not App Academy Plus, but the App Academy Plus was actually more robust. Can you explain that?
Well, I first want to say that both of the treatment groups, none was better than the other. I think it depends on the diagnoses, and thank you for that question, Dr. Lee. I believe, and this goes beyond the scope of my research, but in my own professional opinion, I believe that the reason why the App Academy or the Asperger group did better in that is because their needs are different. Parents of individuals with PDD-NOS autistic disorder might need the foundational principles of evidence-based practices. However, individuals with Asperger's syndrome tend to suffer more in sociability. And so as far as sociability is concerned, there is not necessarily that much of a need for those foundational principles only at will, whenever they're necessary.
Other questions? Dr. Williams?
From your findings in question 4, are you saying that professional help is necessary or not?
I am saying, and if I can just kind of use an analogy really quickly, if you're sick and you have something that you can't treat with over-the-counter drugs, you go to the doctor and they give you a prescription for it. And that way you have to go and you have to get it. But how about if your child has a fever? You know it's a fever, right? So you go to the store and you buy Tylenol and you go by the dosage on the side of the bottle. But you're empowered to go and buy that Tylenol for your child. I feel like the same is true with iPads. iPads are supplemental to interventions that already exist for these children. And so parents need to be educated on how to implement these. So if there is access to that knowledge, they need the knowledge, which professionals can make, but professionals don't need to necessarily approve them feeling empowered to buy an iPad.
But will they know what an evidence-based practice is?
That's a good question. At this time, the market is so saturated, everybody is claiming to have all of these lists. But typically what is happening is people are paying to be added to these lists. And so the REMLE Project, that's what we're trying to do, is just to help families have access to these evidence-based practices and evidence-based applications so that they can implement them with their children safely.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
And with the inclusion process in education, how does this program work with inclusion and using that in the classroom?
It's exactly the same. Because the way that the program or the intervention was set up was for any person who directly impacts the lives of any person with autism spectrum disorder. So as a teacher, if you have an individual in your class who you might not know much about autism about, but you learn that suddenly you have a child in your class with autistic disorder, you can take this intervention and use it so that you can better meet the needs for that child.